Good evening and welcome to the BS and Beer Show. BS stands for Building Science. The topic tonight is economics. It's the first of a series we'll be doing based on the Pretty Good House book chapters. We may or may not fit in some other topics along the way, but just because we did with the Pretty Good House book, we did try to take a pretty holistic approach. It happens to work out well as a guideline for what we're talking about. We did skip over the first chapter, which is kind of a mishmash of small things. And if we really run out of topics, we might go back to it. But we're going to jump in with the second topic, economics. I like to say that I've never done a project that doesn't have a budget, and yet no programs except Pretty Good House consider the fact that every project has a budget. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there, and we're just going to talk about what that means. I am Mike Maines. I am drinking a grapefruit San Pellegrino and a LaCroix coconut. If you want a tropical mocktail, I highly recommend that combination. And I'm just gonna, everybody will introduce themselves after I get through the announcements here. BS and Beer is an independent grassroots movement to share building science knowledge through local meetup groups, and this our Zoom show. The Brew Crew and our guests volunteer our time each month to bring you what we hope is a fun and informative discussion. We encourage you to start your own local group. For information on how to get one started, visit thebsandbeershow.com and check out or check out our December 2022 show. The topic was starting your own group. People are already using the chat box. If you haven't found it already, it's the green box at the bottom of your screen. Post questions and comments there. One little quirk of Zoom is be sure to click all panelists and attendees, or everyone, depending on your browser. Otherwise, Zoom tends to revert to panelists only, so then only we can see your comments. The video recording of tonight's show will be available at Green Building Advisor, and all past shows can be found there and also on YouTube through a link at thebsandbeershow.com. I'd like to thank our media partners, Green Building Advisor and Fine Home Building Magazine, and a couple of announcements for things coming up. Next week is the Upper Midwest Building Science Symposium, but it's already sold out. So get your tickets while you still can for the next Building Science Symposium, which one reason, Travis and crew do a lot of work to get those going. There's one coming up in Stratford, Connecticut, June 20th and 21st. Our own Ben Bogie will be there presenting, and I'll put a link in the chat box. Also, Ben Bogie, if you can't get enough of him, on May 10th at 6 p.m., we'll be talking about framing with engineered studs at a Fun Home Building webinar. So I'll put a link to that in the box as well. And speaking of Ben, how about if do you want to introduce yourself and what you're drinking while I post these things?
Sure. I'm Ben Bogie, and apparently I have a hard time saying no when people email me to ask me to do things. Something I'm working on. I'm aware of it. This evening I'm drinking a large glass of ice water because I'm feeling a little rough around the edges with seasonal allergies and my workload at the moment. So I'm just trying to stay hydrated this evening. And if anybody does want to come out to the Building Science Symposium in Stratford, that's like right in my backyard and where we work. And if you want to come in the day before and come look at some of our job sites, shoot me an email. Ben at bpcgb.com. I'll put it in the chat box. Be happy to have you. And I guess, Rachel, why don't you tell us who you are?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I feel very honored to be one of the mystery guests for tonight's BS and Beer. I was really happy to be asked, Mike, and not sorry that I commented on LinkedIn that I was looking forward to this discussion. I am based in Newton, Mass. I'm CEO of Big Meister Design Build. We are a retrofit and remodeling firm. So, and what am I drinking? I am drinking an Italian white. I forgot to look. My husband does all the wine buying in our office. I forgot to look to see what it was. Not that anyone cares since this is BS and Beer, but nevertheless, that's what I'm drinking. Happy to be here. Dan, I'll pass it to you.
BS and wine would be perhaps an even more apt title for this discussion.
Or as long as it's $2 Chuck.
I am Dan Colbert. Along with Mike, I am one of the co-authors of the Pretty Good House book. I am a building contractor in Portland, Maine. We also do mostly renovations, but we do some new construction as well. Take it away, Brian.
All right. Well, thanks, Dan. Thank you all for inviting me to be here as well. I love coming and joining you all for these discussions, even though I always feel like I'm a little bit out of my league. I'm Brian Pontalillo, longtime editor at Fine Homebuilding and Green Building Advisor. And last year I took the year off from really any work, and I built my version of a pretty good house, which I'm sitting in as we speak. And just tickled, I think, is the word that I use, or the feeling of sitting in this place every day. And since we're talking about economics, I worked out my budget for the project. Here it is. I did it today, and interestingly, I worked on the budget kind of in a haphazard way all along throughout the project, and my numbers come to within $4,000 of what we set out to spend. So I feel pretty good about that. Yeah.
You're looking for work as an estimator?
Yes.
I'll have to work on that labor number, though.
Dan, I hope this doesn't look better than your budgets.
It's better. It's much, your handwriting is much neater than the stuff I hand my clients.
Yeah. Or well, to kick things off, since this is the Pretty Good House series and the Pretty Good House idea was Dan's, and Dan happened to be the lead author of the chapter on economics. Dan, what do you think the title economics really means? This is a pretty vague idea in some ways. So when it comes to high performance building or building in general, how do you see economics as fitting into the overall scheme of things?
Right. So our initial Pretty Good House discussion that Mike and I were at Lothi's many years ago at our building science discussion group in Portland was kind of inspired by various things. The rating systems were becoming increasingly popular, and a lot of us had some concerns about, did it take people down roads that weren't necessarily the right ones to go? And some, if not most of those concerns were economic. Even if, well, whatever. We all know that there is a rapid diminishing returns on various, improvements to your shell. So the question always is, how far do you go before it stops making sense? I'm sure there are fixed rules, but there shouldn't be, because, first of all, it's gotten, home building has gotten obscenely expensive, which makes it just that much harder. But in some ways, it also makes it that much more critical to get the shell right. But right can mean various things. And so I also think we're learning more, right? A lot of us are focusing, well, I guess we've always been focused on air tightness, but I think most of us would not have put air tightness above our value on our list of priorities 10 or 15 years ago, but I think most of us are now. Air sealing is a hell of a lot cheaper than insulating typically. So there's one example. Then there are, of course, the examples of things where pushing things can save you money, right? If you can go, from an R30 wall to an R40 wall, can you reduce your heating system up front and save money right off the bat there? So to me, economics, and the reason that we do talk about it in the book is that there's two reasons. One is that finding the sweet spot between budget and performance is really one of the critical things I think that the contractor really is probably primarily responsible for, but the whole team has to take responsibility for it. And the other is that it's one of the levers you play with. I kind of like the way that budgets focus people's minds and force people to figure out what their priorities are, right? I mean, if the budget's, $30 million, you don't have to make too many hard choices.
All right. What do you say when people ask you how much more does it cost to build a pretty good house than a regular house?
If you have to ask, you can't afford it, I say. Right. More and more I'm saying, well, more and more I'm just saying it doesn't cost anything more. And sometimes I even believe it. There's two things. There's two sides to that. The first is that the energy code is finally getting halfway decent. So just to meet energy code, you're whatever, 3/4 of the way, however much, to building a pretty good house. So if you can push it and, again, reduce the heating system or whatever, certainly reduce your operating costs, then the cost could be zero. And, the difference between building a mediocre house with spray foam or something and building a double stud wall with cellulose, I don't know that it would cost any more. There's a little more labor. I haven't looked, I try to keep the number in mind, but like for me, the ideal double wall is two 2x4 walls, right? So I should always know in my head currently, what's the price of two 2x4s as opposed to one 2x6. But I don't. But it's not a big difference, right?
Right.
More labor. There's the labor of building the second wall, but there's the reduced labor of lifting, building 2x4 exterior walls rather than 2x6 exterior walls. So the short version is nothing, or certainly less than the difference between, cheap tile and
This granite and that granite. Yeah.
Yeah. What's the return on investment of granite versus quartz?
Or a Chevy Volt versus a BMW e-car or whatever it's called.
But Dan, what I hear you saying a lot are you're talking about sort of trade-offs, or trade-offs might not even be the right word, but like dialing in these different aspects of the building. And one of the things that I learned on this project that I did was just how really this all takes shape early in the process, right? In the design phase. And really, what I learned was that like after that design phase, it's really hard to change things much, right? Or to find savings, or like you can change whatever you want, of course, but it's really hard to find savings after you're sort of cemented on that design. So I'd be curious to hear y'all talk a little bit about sort of these decisions that you're mentioning, Dan, and how you're making those, when you're making those, and a little bit about what that process looks like, who's involved, and how it happens.
The biggest lever we have on cost and performance is the size of the building, but that's often the one that we lose. I don't know that I've ever really honestly won that one in a conversation with a client or a designer when I advocate that we make a smaller building. But that's, that would be the easiest way for us to control costs and just pack more quality into it. But people rarely go for that.
I think it's really different in the retrofit cases. But what remains the same, Brian, is the decisions you make in that initial design phase, the schematic or conceptual design phase, are really, it becomes very hard to undo those. I mean, without, or to walk those back and to make different choices about what you're going to focus on. So I think that applies across the retrofit and new construction. But, we're dealing with structures that already exist and that have a lot of sort of constraints baked into them. So I would say that the key, I was thinking about this today and sort of thinking about, coming on this. I think that, everyone comes to us as remodeling contractors, and to even for a new build, they come to us for livability and functionality, right? If we don't address those things, then we've lost. They're not really coming to us out of the gate for performance. I mean, most of the people who work with us want that. I mean, they come to us because they want that too. But if we can't solve their functional needs, right? If we can't build them a house, remodel them a house that works, then you have to figure out how to do those things. And also do the performance, the comfort and the efficiency and the reduced emissions things. So anyway, I'm going a little bit on a tangent here, but I just think these questions are slightly different when you look at it, when you're talking about remodeling versus new construction.
Yeah, but I think even more than with new construction, remodeling is all about trade-offs, right? I mean,
100%.
Every renovation is requires, a totally, well, hopefully you have hopefully you have some tricks from your previous jobs that you can sign, but you go up to an old house, you're bound to find something you've never seen before.
That's true. That's definitely true.
And so there are the things that you need to deal with before you even get started on the energy upgrades, right? I mean, every house in Portland built, before the 1920s has a wet basement.
Yep.
Yeah, and both new construction and renovations, I mean, as part of the pretty good house approach and also passive house training, we talk about or learn about, operating costs versus upfront costs. So which we also use in terms of carbon, which is another thing we should talk about, but just sticking with finances for now. If you, the basic idea, as you all know, is if you spend a little more upfront to get a better house, then your operating costs are lower, and in theory that could balance out. Do you guys talk about that with clients? Do clients seem to be convinced? Does it factor in with bank loans or things like that?
I mean, I think it's probably true for all three of us that people are approaching us. The people who typically are approaching us these days don't need to be convinced. They're choosing us because they want that to begin with. But earlier in my career, and I'm sure for Rachel and Ben as well, it definitely did require some convincing. And if there are people in the audience who are still at the point of needing to convince people, I think energy modeling is probably the best way to go, right? It's relatively easy, even if the accuracy of the energy model isn't fantastic, at least the comparative accuracy ought to be pretty good, right? So you can say, if you do this, it's going to save you whatever, $100, $1,000, whatever dollars a year in heating fuel or electricity or whatever. And then you can make the decision, is a 10-year payback attractive enough to you? Is a 5-year payback attractive enough?
The story that I often share is a number of years ago, before I moved up to start working for Dan, I built a house for my mom. She was approaching retirement age at the time, and I was trying to be really mindful about upfront versus operating cost. And I knew that I was going to put some level of exterior insulation on the project, and I was weighing the difference between 2x4 or 2x6 for the wall system. And what I worked out, and this was same thing, comparative energy modeling, I did heat loads on 2x4 versus 2x6, and I saw what that did to my heat load and learned that it didn't decrease the heat load of the house enough to go into a smaller HVAC system, so there was no savings there. And then I looked at what the operational difference would be, and it showed me that the payback for just the cost of the framing material and the insulation would have been like 45 years. So at that point, I made the judgment call that it's going to be a 2x4 with 2 inches of continuous exterior, and was able to play that game. But you have to, like Dan's saying, you have to have some way to metric that and to compare that, a basic manual J heat load, something in order to have some skin in the game to be able to make those judgment calls.
And then is years of payback the best metric? Is return on investment, or is that the best way, or should we be using more sophisticated, like net present value that's taking into account inflation and all those fancy things? Or do they make a big enough difference to matter? Like, do you just sort of know that a 20-year payback is something like a 5% ROI based on simple math, which is going to be like a 4% ROI factoring in inflation?
I'm a little spurious about taking into account inflation and stuff like that, because we can't predict what the energy costs are going to do, and any attempt at that is just a guess at best. So it's totally dependent, I think, on the client and the person, on what they need in order to convince themselves for the decision they're going to make in that case.
Yeah.
I can't balance my checkbook, so I'm probably not the right person.
I'm curious, are you considering PV in the equation? So the cost of PV, again, balanced against the costs of more insulation or other dials that you can turn.
You just built a house, you tell us.
Well, I didn't consider PV. I built a house. I built pretty good house based on some simple energy modeling. And but then when I was pleasantly surprised to find out that I needed a pretty minimal PV system to get to zero energy, but I didn't consider it. And the cost of the system seems very reasonable when I compare it to what I'd be paying for electricity over time. But I didn't consider it when I was deciding whether to, have, 8-inch thick walls or 10-inch thick walls or 12-inch thick walls and that
Right.
kind of thing.
What about in terms of the orientation, though? I mean, you didn't.
I did consider in terms of orientation, site selection,
Got it.
roof design, that type of thing. Yes.
Sorry, I think I interrupted you, Dan.
To me, I sort of feel like PV is a separate piece, right? I mean, I don't know. I did PV in my house a while ago and I haven't looked at the number. Yes, to the question of PV, I'm sorry. PV is photovoltaic. I think the numbers work out that, I don't know what the payback is, but, especially if you get it financed, I don't know that it's any more expensive, right? And I think a lot of the big solar companies are offering financing themselves. So I think if you look into it, it may not be any more expensive than your electric bill. But I sort of feel like it's a different, you should keep that separate. Figure the house first, as we started saying, the PV is the icing on the cake.
Okay.
Well, or I think of it, it's a different scale. It's like the things that need to happen at the system scale, and I always think of the when I look at sort of carbon saving, I know we haven't gotten into carbon, I attribute those to the grid. You assume all these systems are grid tied. And so those savings, belong at the grid scale. And I think so. I'm just echoing what Dan is saying, but putting it in a slightly different perspective. I want to say something though about remodeling. What?
And it doesn't help, your PV is not going to make your house any more comfortable.
That's correct. So one of the things that I think comes up in sort of new construction, which is a little different, and I'm curious what you find, Dan, in the reno for renovation projects, is that sort of it can be hard to downsize to realize financial savings on your HVAC equipment with sort of additional improvements in the shell, because again, you're working with sort of the constraints of the existing building and the need to reach all of those spaces. And so I see Ben nodding and Dan nodding too. I'm wondering if you find that whole sort of, you can, the trade-offs and the sort of increased investment in shell mean that you can spend less on HVAC doesn't hold true as much for renovations and retrofits.
And even for new houses. So we predominantly do new construction. And generally what we're finding is that our heat loads are small enough that we're in the smallest units anyways, but we have multiples of them in order to serve the distribution to cover the house adequately. And we've kind of hit like a threshold that like, we know this is going to be the cost for an HVAC system in our house, give or take 15%, because that's what it takes to distribute over X amount of square feet.
Right. So it's not just getting the system sizes down. It's also thinking about, distribution plays a huge factor in the upfront cost.
There was that huge issue earlier in the passive house growth phase where people were like, oh, we're going to put a wall unit in and then we're going to distribute it with our ERV. My business partner, Mike, built the first passive house in Connecticut, and he's been through 3 HVAC systems because of the fact that those strategies don't work. It's poorly distributed, and as good as the envelopes are, ends up in stratification and hotter areas and colder areas and different loads, and it doesn't work. So you end up, in order to properly serve a house, having a system of a certain size. And that comes with a cost. Ductwork comes with a cost, equipment comes with a cost, even when it's the smallest load equipment.
Yeah.
And back to PVs for just a second, photovoltaics, it's also, it's really dependent on where you are in politics. Like I think we're in the Northeast where we are pretty good net metering, but a few years ago, our previous governor kind of scared everybody when he took or began ramping down net metering. And in other states, it's like half of production or something. And electricity prices can also be pretty low if you have like large scale hydro or something nearby. So I think the photovoltaic discussion is really location dependent. But just in general, and I went through the PV exercise in my house a couple of years ago, and last year twice, and found that we could get like 3/4 of net zero on our roof, and pay a little bit more in electricity costs, which ended up it would be something like a 10 to 15% return on investment, which is pretty good. Like I look at a lot of pretty good house level investments as having something like a 5 to 10% return on investment, which is kind of stock market territory, but much more secure. And then if you keep going beyond that to like passive house levels, there are still benefits, but the financial return on investment can drop down into single digits, and it can be hard to justify, financially.
Right. Although, like going back to like Ben's mom, if you could also look at it as paying up front for, X kilowatt hours every year, right? So if you are retiring or whatever, you're sort of locking in that budget.
That's one of the Connecticut just restructured its framework around how we do net metering and what options they have here. And basically what they're offering you is they'll fix your utility rate for like 30 years, and they will continually buy it from you and sell it to you at that rate for 30 years, but you have to agree to buy all, sell all from them, which is a great option. I feel like it's not as it's a loss compared to true net metering like we had before, but it is still, a positive option to be able to lock in your finances over time.
Yeah, I mean, it's whatever. One of the many things that drives me crazy is that we have 50 different, metering strategies.
And they continually are getting hedged in the favor of the utilities company and away from the people that actually own the panels.
Yeah. Or so what about carbon? We touched on it earlier. And Rachel, one of your many claims to fame is your recent article in Fine Homebuilding and Green Building Advisor, talking about the fact that your company, Big Meister, used to do and promote a lot of deep energy retrofits, and now you're finding that they don't often make as much sense as they used to, or as you used to think they did, and that seems very, very closely tied in here, both financially and carbon wise.
Yeah, I think so yes, that's true. We have moved away from sort of super insulating, sort of thick layers of insulation outside of buildings, and focusing on working within the kind of existing shell to improve where we can. And when we do add exterior insulation, it tends to be more like 2 inches rather than more, or 2 inches of foam if we're doing foam. But in any event, what we realized is both from a sort of once the utility incentives went away for deep energy retrofits, it became increasingly hard to sell them. So that was one piece. And then the second piece is we sort of learned about embodied carbon and the strategy that we had been employing, the materials that we had been using were front loading a fair bit of carbon into the building. So we were, spending a lot of carbon in order to save carbon. And once we got to the point where we knew, okay, we've got, until 2030 to cut our emissions in half, it just really drove home the question of like, are those investments in carbon that we're making actually helping us? One reason we're all doing this, besides the fact that we like making good houses for people, is, we're trying to do our part to help address the climate crisis. And if we're actually doing something that is not helping us get to that goal, then we should rethink the strategy. So I think it was those two things together that led us to moderate our approach, and also sort of the realization that this also happened, so over the last sort of 6-7 years, is we really need to electrify everything. And so that's sort of, we talked about sort of tuning, or the levers that, where's the next best dollar spent, sort of made us think differently about how much we were going to invest in the shell versus how much we were going to invest in the mechanicals, because we don't want to put in any fossil fuel equipment, at all, ever anymore. And so that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question. I'm sure others have thoughts.
I think that idea, Rachel, that you guys have put forward recently, to some people was kind of a kick in the pants. And it's like, oh, what do you mean deep energy retrofits don't work? I'm taking my ball and going home. And like, it was like a loss. to me, what I took away from that is that it actually shows that we can use a much lighter hand in how we go in and affect buildings and still get the bulk of the low hanging fruit, or get ourselves 85% of the way there, which means that we'll have the ability to feasibly affect more buildings and have more of an impact. So
I'm glad that's what you took away, because I don't want people to think they should take their ball and go home. It just, after years of, beating our heads against the wall, trying to sell, what I call outsolation, and not getting anywhere, and then thinking about, God, all the foam we're adding to these layer, miles and miles of foam that we're adding.
But it's a new blowing agent.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And there seems to be there's like really big gap between folks who wanted to do deep energy retrofits on buildings, and then the rest of the building world, where people were getting sold new windows to improve the energy in their house when they hadn't air sealed their attic yet. And so the industry,
oh my gosh,
on sort of some middle ground where there's energy raters who know how to come out and do a blower door test and find, as Ben said, the low hanging fruit, and just start there.
Or how about the medium hanging fruit? I mean, that's what you're saying, is there's got to be the, between the low hanging fruit, which is, what utilities are incentivizing, which is like really just the low hanging fruit. And then this sort of, the niche audience of people who are doing deep energy retrofits, like there's this huge market in between there, and lots of homes. So we need to do more load reduction than I think a lot of the incentive programs are driving us to do, but we need to do, I think, less than what some folks are doing who are pushing, passive house retrofits for every existing single family home, or maybe not every, but
it's honestly like where we're back to, and I don't mean to get lost down this rabbit hole of moderate retrofits, is like we just need to bring back good weatherization programs and then electrify along with that. And that's how. Yeah.
The key is good weatherization programs. Good. Anyway, Dan, you've been wanting to get in here, so.
I mean, a couple of things. One is that, in response to Brian, I think, our stock response to everybody should be get an energy audit, right? It just seems crazy not to have that information before you do any renovating work. Yeah, and the other is, I'm certainly on board. I did one DER years ago, and it was crazy. I mean, whatever. We learned a lot, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I immediately started advocating for shallow energy retrofits.
Well, you are the inventor of the pretty good home. So that's totally keeping.
That can be my next one. Yeah. And so, on the climate thing, this is a line I learned from Rachel's former boss, Paul Eldrenkamp, that he started saying, this is the worst moment in human history to be dumping carbon into the atmosphere. And, I just think we need to be mindful of that. I think if the payback, if the payback isn't immediate or very fast, then it probably doesn't make sense. I think, mediocre energy retrofits are much better for the planet than DERs.
Right. At this moment in time, I think when we were really gung-ho about DERs, 10, 15 years ago, we didn't realize we sort of had a ticking time bomb on our hands. I mean, we knew that we thought we needed 80% reduction by 2050. I mean, we also have done so little over the course of the last 15 years that it's made it even more important that we keep our time horizon sort of short, right? So that we're like, okay, not doing any more damage, or, let's try to back away from the cliff. Keeping in mind that all the things that we do, those of us who are here tonight and who are listening in, it makes how much difference?
Right.
But it feels good.
It feels good.
What's that, Ben?
Said I'd rather go down swinging than sit on the sidelines, though.
Yeah. Well, this is I think a related question and a bit of a tangent, but just I think a lot about, like, I'm all on board with reducing carbon because we have to. It's our only real choice. But is it really fair to put the pressure on individuals or people like us to try to convince individuals when the reality is we're most likely not going to get where we need to be? And so then is a smarter approach to start thinking defensively and just be like, yeah, we're screwed. Let's build the best houses we can because shit's coming and we need to have bunkers to withstand it. I
Oh
mean,
my gosh.
that could be a little bit hyperbole, but I don't think it's that hyperbolic.
Well, Mike,
You're mostly not my territory, Mike.
First of all, I think that to the first thing you said, I think that, it is, I do think I don't think it's unfair, because I think that, the only place that each of us can affect it is where we work or where we are in our lives. We don't work in transportation, so we can't affect that industry. We can affect the home building design industry. And so that's where we can make, even if it's a small impact, that's where we can make it. But I also, it's interesting to see some of the pioneers. I think of like Alex Wilson, right, who pioneer in the world of pushing green building forward, right, from the 70s on. And then at some point in the early 2000s, he turned to resilience, right? His whole thing became resilience. And that was like, he was the first person where I started to say, oh shit, like Alex knows a lot and he's just switched gears.
Well, it was passive survivability back then. Remember, nobody remember, maybe
Yeah.
people on this remember that passives. But Mike, I think you have a good point, because one of the biggest questions that we've gotten, about sort of the moderate approach is resilience, and particularly these buildings being able to coast without power from the grid. I think that's I think that's a tough question.
Yeah.
So many of these things that we're dancing around here, though, are personal choices related to the value that the client places in them. Like right now, we don't have a real way until we get into like carbon accounting for tax credits and stuff like that to place a real value on the carbon part. So it really has to be a personal alignment for the client, and they have to be able to assign a value for that to make that choice. They also have to be able to assign a value to how resilient they want their house to be, because that's a risk judgment on their end. So it's,
Yep.
not to get too gray in the economics area, but when we start getting into this beyond the quick upfront cost calculations, it really does become a personal choice for the client to make.
But to return to Mike's point about the individual stuff too, I think it's, in fact, I just presented to the peer network that I'm in, that Paul Eldrenkamp again is the moderator for today. In fact, it's important to remember that carbon footprint was an invention of the fossil fuel industry in order to, avoid their own culpability in this and try to say, it's up to individuals to stop global warming.
Yeah.
The plastic straws, Dan, that's going to save us.
Yeah, plastic straws. No, just this morning, I was explaining to somebody that although natural gas, which is an excellent marketing term for methane, its global warming potential actually isn't horrible. It's like 25 or 30, but it's it only lasts about 10 years in the atmosphere. And so, but global warming potential is measured on a 100-year scale. So you're comparing something that only even lasts 10 years to something that lasts 1,000 years, and saying that the thing that lasts 10 years is 30 times worse, but it's only even exists for 1% of the time. So it's this huge bomb, but it's called natural gas and it burns cleanly, so it must be okay, right? And I mean, I'm not saying it's not okay, but what?
They're playing right now. They're trying to sell us on, hydrogen is going to be the transition fuel. It's, it's the same thing. It's repackaged.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just looking at the chat and there's a couple of good questions. One of them is just to define deep versus shallow. I think Ben sort of talked about that a little bit with weatherization is the shallowest of the shallow, but it probably is also, I always think that, Maine has a lot of old crappy housing stock, and I feel like it would be pretty goddamn simple to reduce the energy consumption of all these houses by 20-30%, just by sending a crew over for a few days. So, yeah. So
yeah, I think in terms of working within the existing shell, so air sealing and then insulating the cavity, insulating the cavities that you have reasonable access to, but not trying to thicken the shell.
Right, because another one of the questions is, if a house is replacing siding, do we just let it go at Tyvek, blah, 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 and fan folded vinyl over it?
Oh, that was Ken Newhouser. I saw that come by, and I know why he's asking that question.
Right. But that's a perfect example of not, at that point, I would say that's not a DER. If you're replacing the siding, a DER is tearing off the siding to put exterior insulation on.
But maybe maybe you put on 2 inches, you don't go
Well,
to the,
But I guess what I'm saying is, for me, what made the DER less attractive was doing things, replacing things that did not need to be replaced in order to put more insulation behind them. If you're replacing,
agreed.
if you're replacing your siding, go to town, man. Think about it. Also, just think about opportunity, right? I think that's a big issue. Hopefully no one's going to replace that siding for another 50 or 100 years, right? So the decision that you make is going to affect your house for a long time, hopefully.
I mean, a couple things I would say here. One is, I think there's this notion out there that there's a lot of old siding that needs to be replaced, and that's really not the case, at least in our experience. Like, it's not like a roof that, like, after 25 years, it's like, okay, it's time for a new roof. I mean, that's one thing. The other thing is, when you talk about go to town, it's like, well, what are the roof overhangs, and does that trigger then needing to rebuild the roof wall intersection? So it's a cascade effect, and so
I'm doing a very shallow energy retrofit on my house. I'm in the historic district, so I can't really thicken up my wall. So I have these great old scalloped, mitered shingles, and they're 100 years old. They're not holding paint particularly well, but I carefully peeled them off, and I'm just going to flip them over and put them back on. Put up some self-adhesive Obdike, the Hydro Gap that has the little bubbles on it to get both a good air seal and hopefully a halfway decent rain screen, and call it good.
Or there's also, or we talk about exterior insulation like it's one option, but there are lots and lots of ways to do exterior insulation. Of course, the most common are different types of foam. Probably the next most common is mineral wool. And then newest to the market and most exciting for us nerds is rigid wood fiber, which is currently available, but it's the most expensive option now. But Maine-based GoLab will, in theory, soon be actually starting to sell, after years of promise, wood fiber insulation. And this fall, supposedly, they'll start with rigid wood fiber at a competitive cost. What they're competitive with has changed a little bit over time, but if it's competitive with other options, it's really nice to work with. It's decent R value. I wonder what if that's going to be well accepted by the industry. How much lack of doing it is the cost of things like mineral wool or reaction against foam. I don't think most people understand that foam is bad in some ways, but what do you think what's my point here? How much do you think the cost and relative merits of specific materials affect choices of DERs or medium energy retrofits or shallow energy retrofits, or is it really just more about the overall global cost of the work?
I'll throw in one thought here real quick, and it's triggered by the IRC. Is now that we have continuous insulation in the IRC for climate zones 5 and above, that's gonna, I think, drive a lot more of the sales growth of exterior insulation choices. One thing that I want to be really clear on, because I've seen it batted around in there, is that people think that mineral wool is much lower carbon than foam, and we're at this point now with the new blowing agents and the XPSs and EPS and rigid mineral wool, that most of those are pretty close in the broad spectrum to being very neck and neck with each other from an emission standpoint. So to say that one is much better than the other is kind of a false argument. But to your point, Mike, and your question about how much impact is GoLab going to have, or Timber HP, with that's when we look at the amount of exterior insulation that's sold in this country year after year, and you look at how much they're going to be able to produce, that's a drop in the bucket as far as being able to affect a change or some sort of meaningful ecological impact.
Right. Yes. So
yeah, I mean, one of my concerns with going back to the embodied carbon is you would hate to see it's great that the codes in a way are getting more stringent, but you would hate to see that triggers an increased reliance on higher, which I think it will in the short term, higher embodied carbon materials, because that's what's available. That's how people know how to build. And so that's a, you know, a negative unintended consequence that I don't know what to do about, but it's a thing.
I think the foam industries are trying to make it much better, even despite legislation and politics. They still pick the ball up. You know, we could have had that second generation blowing agent pulled out of all those products 6 years ago, but that got nixed because of politics. But yet we still saw the industry push forward with doing that on their own dime. So there is some positive there. And I think we are, like I said, we're at that point now where they're all have come down. Like XPS used to be awful. Like what was it, like 7,200 or something like that? Now we're down like 1,100 on some of them. Like they're all getting better. Like fingers crossed that it happens in time.
Yeah.
The industry will have a say in that. If the industry starts to demand certain products, then the market share grows, the prices come down. So it is incumbent to some degree on designers and builders to be moving in that direction.
Yeah.
And it's expensive too. I mean, that's the part I never get. Like, you know, we were just talking about wall sections. Was that up in at the Hammond thing? I think talking about wall sections, and you know, to me, it just I never understood how people could even argue in new construction for all these outsolation strategies, which just struck me as complicated and expensive and hard to pull off.
But to the book's point, though, Dan, it's, you know, it is so dependent on the builder. Somebody, I've talked to guys that they can do it and they can pull it off at the same cost that it cost me to do a double stud, which that blows my mind. But
yeah,
you know, there's no one perfect product. It's the one that you're comfortable installing.
How about or a little bigger picture is single family versus multifamily? I mean, or we're all single family people. So we're sort of on the wrong side. I mean, it costs less to live in a multifamily, to operate one. It's easier to get reduced carbon emissions. Why aren't we all pushing harder for multifamilies, or why aren't people buying multifamilies, or is there an opportunity in single family to do a lot better if we switch to more like dense, smaller homes, cottage courts and pocket neighborhoods and those kinds of development approaches?
Well, now you're getting into the whole zoning question, which is sort of reminiscent of where we were with the PV. This is like a broader, I mean, it's even worse than that we have 50 regulations around, right? We've got local control. And so we need to change zoning. That's the short answer to the question, but that's easier said than done. You know, it's my city, Newton, is going through a whole zoning redesign and reform, and it's, you know, the amount that we're going to get towards greater density is not where it needs to be or should be. So
It's to that same point, Rachel, we were just putting together preliminary numbers for a 6-unit multifamily with some component of it being low income housing. And it really wanted to go forward, and the developer really wanted to go forward, but it ended up getting shot because they changed where the income threshold was based upon. It was based on the state average versus the local average, which, you know, where we exist is very high cost of living. So it totally killed the debt service for that developer, and there was no way he could move forward on it. And of course, you know, there was a profit motive and all that involved there. But to that effect, he's motivated to try and head in that direction, but it got hamstrung at, you know, the state political level and their short-sightedness and being able to see that he was trying to do something good locally. But we're very much trying to find ways into high performance multifamily. It's tough though.
Yeah, it's like or people really bought the American dream idea, and the foam industry has been really good at convincing people foam is good. And you're right, Ben, it is much better than it used to be. It's still not as good as something like wood fiber or cellulose. So it's Americans are good at buying a convincing sales pitch, I think.
Capitalism's great, isn't it? And
it is.
Comrade Colbert missed that. He would have appreciated that.
Yeah. I said it partly for his benefit, but there he is.
Sorry, my kitten just got spayed today and I had to deal with her for a second.
Oh,
Yeah, so I will, another thing that I did in my presentation today was say that one of the things that I've been obsessing over is single family detached, a white supremacist colonial approach. So more on that at some point.
that's
Yeah.
a,
Can't just drop a bomb like that and then say more on that at some point. Like,
Tune back in at 8. Yeah.
yeah,
So like single family detached is, you know, it's the whole land use
yeah,
is based on theft and resettlement.
right.
Loss of communal living and yeah.
Yeah, so I think that you know, there's a few things. One is we've underinvested in housing for a very long time, right? So the only, you know, I don't know if we're going to get out of it or whatever, but we definitely need multifamily. And I, you know, feel very, I mean, I'm thrilled I heard about this project from the architect for it earlier today that Ben's doing. And, you know, it's a great model and I hope they can figure out how to do it. You know, if I were younger or starting out, I would love to get involved in multifamily. You know, the problem is, well, whatever, as Ben said, you know, the problem with multifamily is that the incentives are so insane. You know, you've got to, the financing is crazy. It's just whatever. We're not, it has to be a public investment is the only way that that's going to happen.
But there is traction in it. Like throughout New York right now, there is a tremendous amount of growth, relatively speaking, in passive multifamily low income throughout the New York boroughs, because the way those models work is the developer gets a fixed check every month for the energy costs on that building. So what they've discovered is if they lower the operational energy of that building, the federal government is still going to cut them that same check every month. So what they've done is they find that they're 1 to 3% more on the cost of construction, but that's paid back in about 3 years, and past the 3-year mark, they're pulling in higher profits. So there are these weird little parts of the system that's happening.
Right, and I think that that's another thing that's right. It's great that right. I think it's great. That's one of the things that I always think about development is that, like, I wish that the developers were like legally required to own their projects for 10 or 20 years, right?
Yeah. Well, that's incentivizing them in these cases where they are looking at holding them as a long-term asset versus the, you know, turn and burn.
Right.
Yeah, a new acquaintance of mine is really into this or incremental development, neighborhood development. His name's John Anderson. He's pretty prolific on Facebook. If you want to follow him, he's very open with information. We disagree a little bit on energy related things, but just he's doing it from his end, and he has some interesting things like he's a big fan of multifamilies, but the fire codes make it really challenging that you need pretty intense, extremely expensive fire suppression systems once you're at like 4 units usually. And so he's trying to get some code changes such that if you have like 2-hour firewalls between units instead of 1 hour, then you can do a simpler fire suppression system or no fire suppression system. Just, you know, those kinds of things. I don't fully understand the details, but just I can see that, like, if you're adding $100,000 to a 4-unit, it could that you're aiming to build each unit for $100,000. It's pretty tough on the ROI. But on the other hand, you don't want the building to fall down. We are getting to the end of our hour here. Do we want to start throwing out some last thoughts, big takeaways, your own missions?
One of the points, which maybe is a good wrapping up point on the retrofit front, is, you know, again, back to some stuff Brian was saying, and I'm sure Rachel would agree, is that, you know, well, I keep beating the energy audit drum, but one of the opposite approaches to a DER is opportunity, right? And again, back to sort of owning the house longer, right? It seems like occupancy is slowly creeping back up from the ridiculously short term that it has been. If people are staying in their houses longer, you know, and hopefully working with one contractor over a couple of decades, you know, if you have a plan, every time you open up a wall, you can do part of the plan on that section, you know, whether it's insulating or air sealing or running line sets for a future, you know, for a future heat pump, anything like that.
I completely agree, Dan. The whole point, I mean, no renovation should pass by without taking advantage of opportunities to improve performance, but that requires a holistic plan. And you know, and it requires remodeling contractors to be focused on that, right? And not look at these as sort of one-off projects that are, I think it needs sort of a transformation of our industry. I don't feel like there are a lot of remodeling contractors who have that perspective that you and I have.
Or clients that have the knowledge to understand that they need something like that.
Yep, that too.
Yeah. I
So
guess
maybe, good, Ben.
I guess the little piece I can share as a wrap up is because most of my work is in new construction. I'm pricing quite a few jobs. When I look at the total cost for me to make a high performance building, I'm looking at something that's like 0.5% of the gross project budget. So when we look at it in that term, to make that little uptick in, you know, taking a house from code built to truly high performance, net zero ready type of thing, it's in the scale of about 0.5% of the project, sometimes even less.
Oh. Brian, last thoughts?
Yeah, last thoughts. Well, this was session on economics, but we covered a lot of ground. I think I want to leave with two. I think I have two things I want to say. Like, first is that, like, you know, we talked about maybe a little bit about some of this effort being futile in terms of the climate implications, and, you know, Dan mentioned, you know, the social implications of single family housing, and yet this is where we work. I want to say that again, and it's not. And these things aren't going to change very fast. So, you know, do it with clear eyes, of course. You know, what Dan brought up and what, you know, Dan brought up about social stuff, and Mike brought up about, you know, climate stuff and our impact are true. So do it with open eyes, but keep pushing because it's so important.
Excellent. I think Dan and I and Chris and Emily need to get going on our second book, Pretty Good Renovations, because this is the kind of thing that we need to talk about and sort of just, you know, set the model of this is how you think through it. Not that any of us have time to start a new book. Anyway, and the other thing is, in Back to the Future, we were supposed to have Mr. Fusions by now, so we would each have our own little mini nuclear reactor that would just render this whole conversation moot. So I think somebody needs to get going on Mr. Fusion and clean nuclear storage. And I'm only partially joking. All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Panelists and audience, lots of great questions. Sorry we couldn't get to everything. There will be a recording of this available in a few days, and we will see you here next month. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.